Oh, it's muted, huh? Sharon, when you recorded to the cloud, is it possible for us to have access to it later on?
You
This
mean
is
after the
Martha.
program?
Yeah.
Okay,
do
good
you know?
evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sharon Berry, and with us this evening is Rich Friedman. And just a couple of technical things. So as we go through the program, you can use the chat box to submit questions at any time. And if you would mute your sound during the program, and then you can unmute it at the end when we have the questions and answers. And I may have to distract myself to let people in as we continue here. So there's always the time zone is a little confusing, the different time zones for people. My father was Ben Feiner. He was a Holocaust survivor from Będzin, Poland. The town of Będzin is close to the German border, and my father was born there in 1930. His family had lived there for 4 generations. I did not know that until recently from some research that I discovered from JRI Poland. But his family had lived there, both sides, maternal and paternal families, from the early 1700s. In 1939, the population of Będzin was about 50,000 people, and half of the population was Jewish. The great synagogue in Będzin was built right next to the castle of Casimir the Great and was a very prominent figure. And the Jewish people that lived in Będzin played a very prominent role in the community. The Germans invaded Poland, as we know, in September of 1939. My father was separated from his family. We don't know the exact date. Early in the war, the Germans came into their apartment and shot his dog, the family dog, whose name was Rex. And as the blood pooled on the floor, his family stood in disbelief. They were taken downstairs to the courtyard, and the men and the young men were separated on one side of the courtyard, and women, children, and people deemed or looking elderly or not able-bodied were placed in other corners of the courtyard. My father was loaded on a truck, and as he drove off, that was the last time he saw his mother and his siblings. From there, he was in a work camp called Klobuck, and then after Klobuck, there was possibly another camp. And then in April of 1945, he was in a sub-camp of Auschwitz called Blechhammer. The Allies liberated Auschwitz in January of 45. And shortly before that, my father was on the death march, approximately 12 days in very cold weather with several thousand other people. And they arrived at a camp called Gross Rosen, where he was for a few days, I believe 5. And then he was loaded on a train, which was an open coal car, in February, in very cold weather in Germany. And he arrived at Buchenwald in early February of 1945. So my father this was, I think, the 3rd camp that he was, or 4th camp by then that he was in. I could share many other stories, but I want to stay focused on the story at hand. I'm going to read a little bit from my father's book that he wrote called Silent for 60 Years. If I hold it up, I think you can see it there. Oh, it's backwards. So we're in April of 1945. And I will read verbatim what he says, but I may skip over some of it. Early in the morning on April 23rd, it started to rain. At 10 o'clock, we were marching downhill along a road outside Cham, Germany. Through the pouring rain, I saw two tanks appear over the top of a hillside off to the left. I didn't know who the hell it was. I looked at the tanks and thought, maybe they're going to use their machine guns. After 6 years of trying so hard to stay alive, I thought this is where it was going to end. And I would end up just like all the others I'd seen over the years, just one more dead body along some godforsaken road. Then we could see some men marching behind the tanks, and we could tell they were wearing green uniforms. Some guys yelled, "It's the Americans," and that was pure joy. The Germans guarding us began running into the forest. The tanks rushed over there and began blasting into the woods with their flamethrowers. It was quite a sight. I stood dumbstruck in delight and watched. Within a short time, the Germans came walking out of the woods with their hands in the air. As the combat troops continued moving forward with the tanks, support units arrived. The American soldiers came up and started telling us things in English. I spoke Polish, Yiddish, a little bit of German, Hungarian, but not a word of English. One of the guys came over, and I'll never forget his name, Israel Friedman. He said to me in Yiddish, "What's your name?" He was Jewish. I couldn't believe it. I had heard a great deal about the American soldiers, but I just never imagined that they were Jewish. I blurted out, "My name is Bendit." He told me that I was safe now. I was going to be okay. I sat down in the wet grass, utterly and completely stunned. Was this a dream? My heart was overflowing with joy, but my head took a while to catch up. For many years, I thought of one thing and one thing only, staying alive. Over and over, every moment of every single day, I repeated the same thoughts. Keep your eyes down, keep your mouth shut, keep working, keep walking. Then in a heartbeat, it was over. The horror was over. I was free. I was free to look up at the sky. I could look directly at people. I could look right into the eyes of this wonderful American soldier named Israel Friedman. I could do all this, and no one was going to hit me in the chin with a rifle. Nobody was going to put a bullet in my head, and it was a wonderful moment. My heart was singing. My mind was spinning. So after that meeting, Rich will share some information with you. Sorry, it's still, no matter how many times I read it, it's very difficult. I think when the pain stops, I'll stop talking maybe. But my father and Israel spent several days together talking, and Rich will share some information about you, for you now.
Well, it's funny because I knew nothing about this my whole life. I knew my dad had been at Buchenwald, and he would talk about it if we asked him to, but he never related this story until the day after Thanksgiving in 2018. And brought me to show. And I got an email from Sandy, from Sharon, and she quoted this portion of the book, and I was unable to read it out loud. It's having the same effect on me now. So let me talk about my father. All right, Shane, take a deep breath. I have many friends and cousins who I haven't seen in a long time, and I see my nephew and my sister-in-law on the screen as well as her sister Martha, who happened to be with us the day I got the email. All of them knew my father, and if they have anything they want to add as we go along, they're welcome to do so. My father was born in 1913, so by World War II, he was already wind up being an older soldier. He would have been in his 30s. Before the war, he was active in the labor movement and the anti-war movement. But in 1942, we believed that this fight was his, so he enlisted in the army, but was rejected because of his terrible eyesight. He always had bad eyesight. Yet in 43, they wound up drafting him. I think they were getting to the bottom of the bucket of people that they could draft to fight. When they take a 32-year-old man with horrible eyesight, he was shipped off to Camp Shelby in Mississippi. It strikes me as an irony. A liberal guy, liberal Jewish from Brooklyn named Israel, spending a year in Mississippi. I always thought this would be a traumatic event for him. He seemed to have recalled it positively. Ultimately, he was trained as a pharmaceutical and laboratory specialist and assigned to the 122nd Evacuation Hospital. We became more familiar with these hospitals with the TV show and the movie MASH. I think these were the equivalent, the Mobile Army Hospital. Late in 44 and 1940, early 45, he was shipped to England and France and ultimately crossing into Germany on March 29, 1945. This is very close to the end of the war, which actually happened. Today is the anniversary of VE Day, May 6th. As far as I can tell, the 120th Evacuation Hospital, although it was meant to evacuate wounded soldiers, never saw fighting, never saw a wounded soldier in their entire period of the war. But they happened to be the first medical unit that arrived at Buchenwald concentration camp. They reached it on April 15, 1945. My father spent about a week there. Later in life, in the mid-80s, he did an interview with Yale University where he said he spent 2 weeks at Buchenwald, but this doesn't seem possible to me for reasons I'll explain. So I think he was there for about a week. When we would talk to him about Buchenwald, he never talked about individual cases. What I remember the most in talking about is how badly they were equipped and trained to deal with a problem of this magnitude. Thousands of starving people. They thought the best thing to do was feed them, and it happened to be a Sunday, so they fed them a lot of pancakes and bacon. Well, I don't imagine they fed them that much bacon, but a lot of pancakes. And these guys, they didn't want to eat it, but they were talked into eating it, and the systems were not able to handle the rich food. So most of them went around back and promptly threw it up, or worse, some of them died from it. In the week they were there, I found this out today doing a little research. They met as patients in addition to thousands and thousands of starving people. 5,490 patients, including 330 cases of tuberculosis, 208 cases of dysentery, 62 with typhus, 49 with pneumonia, and 98 with something called contagion, whatever that might be. After about a week in the Buchenwald, they moved on to the town of Cham, where he wound up meeting Ben Feiner. At Cham, they immediately did what mobile army hospitals do. They set up their tents and requisitioned some of the buildings in the town for a mobile hospital. In and around Cham, they came across 10,000 survivors that had been on a death march, my father says, from the Flossenburg concentration camp, and then abandoned by the German soldiers as the army troops arrived, as described in Ben's book. Among these scattered survivors was the young Ben Finster. After the war, he returned to college, earned a degree in social work, married Rebecca Krugman, and had 2 sons, myself and my brother Jack. He spent the lion's share of his career supervising the office of attendance teachers and truant offices in the disadvantaged Brooklyn neighborhood of Bedford-Stuyvesant. He devoted his professional life to working with disadvantaged kids.
Take a deep breath, Rich. You want me to bring up the slideshow now?
Yeah.
Okay. So you can see where Buchenwald is in the top of the map, and Cham is below. My dad and several thousand other prisoners were marched out of Buchenwald somewhere between the 6th and the 11th before the Americans arrived. So that's a pretty long journey, as you can see there. My dad was 14 at this point in time. Interesting.
You can see it's about 500 kilometers.
This is Israel. Whoops, back one.
Can you back up a slide here? This is my dad looking very professional, and I think he probably was. As I said, he was a little more mature than most of the other soldiers at the time. He was a very modest, he was very self-confident guy. He always exuded confidence, but he was very modest about it. He never talked about his own personal accomplishments. But he was always a little older than the circle of friends, and he was probably a little older than most of the drafted people in the 121st Medical Act, but he probably got along very well with the professionals, doctors, and the professionally trained people. But he showed these qualities throughout his life. Sharon put together this slideshow. These are all pictures taken by Margaret Bork White, who was the famous photographer for Life magazine during the war.
First woman staff photographer for Life magazine.
The 124th Evacuation Hospital put together this book after the war. Much of it was written by my father. I was reviewing it today. It's interesting because they talk at some length. They have an entire chapter devoted to Buchenwald and what they experienced there. They make very little comment about the refugees they found at Cham. They did mention that they set up a hospital and continued to serve them. But they go out of their way to say that being in Cham was the happiest experience they had in the war. From Cham, they were in June, this is barely a month later, they were shipped back to America, the war was over. Can you go to the letters again, Sharon?
Mm-hmm.
In Ben's book, he on this, whether my father ever mentioned it. I don't really find any evidence of it, but this is a letter written by Friday the 27th from Cham to my grandmother. He met Ben Feiner on April 23rd, 4 days earlier. So he's talking about what he saw there. Let me find my copy because I met.
It's too small to read.
It actually comes through pretty well on my screen. But first interesting thing to me is my father's typing. He was a hunt and peck typer, you know, all pointers. And he typed these letters as if there was a shortage of paper. It's all single spaced. It's just about to the end of the paper. It's a lot of words in 2 pages. But he says in this letter, how can I, writing to his mother, how can I tell you about the terrible things that we saw and heard about? So many of the prisoners were Jews from Poland, especially the children. And they were so happy to discover that I could speak to, that I could talk to them, that they swarmed around to tell me everything they had suffered. He goes on to say, Mom, some of those kids were in the concentration camps for 4 years and more. There was this one kid who attached himself to me one day and had a terrible desire to send him home. If there had been any way that you would have had another son. He was 8 years old, 4 of them spent in camps, good-looking kid. His father had been with him until just before the American troops came in. This sounds a lot like Ben's story, except for my father saying he was 8 years old. Now, this just could have been an error. He may have been conflating things. As you can tell, he didn't have a word processor. He may have said something he didn't mean to say, but there's no way he could go back and fix it. But it seems to me this is a possible reference to Ben Feiner. Do you have any thoughts on that, Sharon?
Well, there was, my dad's memory was not 100% for obvious reasons. Was psychological damage, physical damage. Um, but he did talk about the time that he spent with Israel, and Israel saying that he wanted to adopt him, and the time frame of when they, there are certain things that line up, and then certain things that are a little off. Because my dad, remember, Rich, my dad talks about um, Israel having two boys already, so he was either clairvoyant or or confused, because Israel was he was not married and didn't
That
have
we
children
know
yet.
of.
Pardon?
He was not married at that time that we know
And you weren't born in 1945, were you?
of. No, neither was my brother.
Right. So,
But
and
he may have
again,
been putting in, like, in writing his book, he may have been saying what he had learned about my father, and then he just transported it back to me when he met him in Germany.
it's possible. All right. Oh, I want to go back one. So after the war for my father, he did not, when he and Israel separated, my dad was in a DP camp, a displaced persons camp in Com, and he did not accept Israel's offer to adopt him. He said that he wanted to look for his family. He went to, or got on trains and traveled around Germany looking for his mother and his siblings, who he did not find. He then went to Ireland, because his aunt and uncle had migrated there before the war, and his uncle had a factory there, and he worked there. He met my mother. Not to short shrift this part of his story, but then he went to Canada, because he could not enter the United States at that point in time. He stayed in Canada several years, and then came to the States, to St. Louis, Missouri, where his father was. It was not his plan to stay in St. Louis, but he did. So when he came to the States, he had 3 children, and then he had 4 more children while in St. Louis. So for us growing up, my father did not talk about what he lost and what he suffered. It wasn't until 1995, when Marcy Rosenberg, who was with the the Holocaust Museum in St. Louis, had just opened, and Marcy was the emissary, for lack of better words, for the Shoah Foundation that was set up by Steven Spielberg to go around the world and collect, I believe, 52,000 testimonies from Holocaust survivors. This is a screenshot of my dad talking to Marcy in 1995 when he was interviewed. She had asked him at this point what he felt, what he had lost, whether was missing from his life, and he said love. He said, his family was stolen from him, and the love was just stolen from him. This was shortly after the museum opened, and this testimony was taken by my dad. Eventually, Marcy was able to convince him to continue to speak to students and at the Holocaust Museum and throughout the community. In the last 20 years of his life, he was a fervent speaker. It was very healing for him. The Holocaust Museum community, healed and transformed my father. He created all kinds of videos, and he wrote his book. Before my father died, he wanted my sister and I to continue his legacy of Holocaust education, and that is the reason why we set up this foundation, the Hannah Ida Ehrman Foundation, that is named after his mother. The name has been somewhat, it's not the Polish spelling of her name. It's the, the Americanized version. So as Israel mentioned, and Israel, sorry about that, Rich mentioned in 2018, my father died in 2016, and then once we set up this foundation, I started doing research, and I found a picture of my dad I'd never seen from 5,000 photos that had been donated to Yad Vashem. I found a cousin in Israel I didn't know existed. I found my father's grandfather's, my great grandfather's grave just outside of Benjamin, Poland, and his monument still standing, one of the few Jewish cemeteries that was not destroyed. So I was planning to go to Poland last year, but everybody knows why I didn't go, unfortunately. So I'm hoping to go either later this year or next year to see my great grandfather's grave and to visit Benjamin. And just things just kept happening, searching and finding different things. And then in July of 2018, I received an email from the Buchenwald Memorial about an artifact that was found on the grounds there. So when I was marketing this event or promoting this event, I shared some of those news articles. I mean, I don't know if anyone had a chance to read those, but it's an amazing story in and of itself, that my father made this artifact in Blechhammer, and it ended up in Buchenwald and being found on an archaeological dig, and then it's found its way to, they found me, and we just donated it to the Holocaust Museum in St. Louis. But after I received this email and got over the shock of what it said, this I wanted to read more about what my father experienced in Buchenwald. So I was rereading his book, what he wrote about Buchenwald and what he wrote about Israel, and how he tried to find Israel. And I was just so moved by it, and I decided to pick up the baton and continue my dad's search, because he never found Israel. So I have some experience researching. It's something that I enjoy very much, and I don't give up. I just keep going. Let's see what's here. Oh, I want to go back. So, one piece of information led to a next, and while I was looking for Israel, there were two Israel freedmen from Brooklyn that both served. So I'm going down these two paths of Israel freedmen, and after some time, it appeared that sorry, I just admitted someone. One Israel freedman was in the Pacific Theater, and the other Israel freedman was in Germany. So I felt that that's the person that I needed to pursue. And it's very challenging when you don't have, you're just looking at records that you find and trying to associate them with the appropriate person. And then I found that Israel had passed away. The one Israel that I was looking for, as well as the other one, but the one that I felt was the right Israel, I wasn't certain. And then from his obituary, I saw that he had two sons, but I believe at that time that Rich's brother had passed by then. Is that right, Rich?
No, he was not. He passed away in 2007.
Oh, okay.
My father passed away in 2000.
Okay, so that's right. So then in looking for the children of Israel, that's when I discovered that your brother was deceased and that Rich was alive. So one, piece of information led to the next, and then I hit a wall and I stopped, and then I resumed my research a few months later, and then I found he was a lawyer, he lived in California, and then you run, the trail stops, and I contacted the school where he used to teach, and he'd already left, and Thanksgiving of 2018, I think my father and Israel must have had dinner together wherever they are, because the next day I woke up and I said, I'm going to find Richard Friedman today. And I did.
So amazing.
I did. It was gone. It wasn't. And then, I stopped working on it. And it just came to me, and I'm like, this is the day. So I actually went to the California bar, and Rich's email was still there. Well, there was an email address there. And from that, let's see, let's pause this, sorry. I wrote an email, and it's here, and I've just highlighted some of the beginning that says, I'm searching for Richard Friedman, who is the son of Israel Friedman of blessed memory. In these days of Thanksgiving, I'm very thankful for the compassion and empathy Israel Friedman showed my father, Ben Feiner, when he found him in 1945 in Com. I've included below some of what my dad wrote in his memoir. And then I just explained that after that, how they spent time together talking. And I just hit send, and off the email went. I was uncertain whether I had the right person or not.
This shows the virtue of never changing your email address, ever.
Rich, did you already share where you were and what happened when you received this email?
Martha, who is one of the people watching this, my sister-in-law's sister, has been spending Thanksgiving with us in Sacramento. She lives in Sausalito, which is about 50 miles away. And when we moved to Lacey, Washington, she actually flew up the first several until last year when nobody flew. She's joined us for Thanksgiving up here in Washington State. So we went out to lunch the next day, the day after Thanksgiving, at a nice restaurant up here. As Ann and Martha went off to the bathroom, I was sitting there and just checking my phone. And the subject line was just something like "Blessed Days" or something like that. My immediate reaction was, this is just another political solicitation or charitable solicitation. And I usually just delete those without reading them. Something compelled me to look a little further. And then I had the reaction that I had tonight. So when they came out of the bathroom, I couldn't read it to them. So I just handed my phone to Ann, and she read it. I think it's a miracle that they found me. I mean, I'm no longer in Brooklyn. I'm not even in Sacramento any longer. We're in Lacey, Washington, and retired. I thought I'd covered my trail well enough. But Sharon dragged it up and found me.
Well, as I said, I think possibly Ben and Israel had something to do with that too.
Well, Ben writes in the book about how he's the brother we almost had.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you show the next slide, Sharon? This is a picture I got from another cousin, one that I have very little relationship. He's about 5, 6 years older than me. So, when we were kids, he didn't even hardly talk to me. But when my uncle, his father died, he was a bit of a pack rat. And that's where I got the letters from book and wall that my father had, and this amazing family photo. My father, I'm going to point on the screen, you don't see me pointing. He's the young man at the bottom left-hand corner of the picture. Sharon has the arrow on him. And next to him are his two brothers, Max and Richard also. Using my brilliant deductive skills, I've concluded this picture was 1927 and 1928. I noticed that all the men are wearing hats. This is a Passover dinner. In the Jewish tradition, the men are wearing hats. And the only child wearing a hat is my father. So I figure he must have been 13 or 14 at this time, which would make it 1920, since he was born in 1913, it would make this picture 1927 and 1928. But it's an amazing picture, I think. Another thing I never knew existed until it just turned up in my email one day. Stevie, you would remember my grandparents. In the second row on the right-hand screen, the third person in, the second woman was a baby on her lap. That was my grandmother who lived upstairs from us all those years. You're muted, Stevie. Unmute yourself, Steve.
He can't hear you.
Yeah, I remember your grandmother for sure. Next door to me and upstairs. Yeah. She didn't mind us when we were roughhousing too much.
No, she was great. She was
Yeah.
very calm. She taught me, she used to play catch with me in my alley.
Oh, gosh.
Such a great picture.
It is a great picture.
Who is the man in the middle?
It's said with some confidence that it's the patriarch of the family, but that's about it. I have no idea. Certainly no one I ever met. Judging from his age, he would have had to have been about 150 by the time I was born.
And I love, oh, this is,
This is an article my father was interviewed by the staff writer at the Danbury newspaper, a lady named Janet Higby, I guess. Where my father talked about his experience at Buchenwald, and as I mentioned, Yale University was doing a survey and making video recordings of people who had had some relationship with the Holocaust, American soldiers who had some relationship to the Holocaust. And my father did about an hour-long interview that was videotaped, and which I had a copy, and I referred to it in preparing my background to this history. And I know I sent this copy to Sharon and Sandy also. And he
It was
comes
really-
across as a modest guy in the video, I thought, taking no credit for anything, lamenting about the fact that they were so ill-equipped to deal with the medical catastrophe that they found.
yeah, the video of your father speaking was so meaningful because you could just, he just exuded just gentleness and kindness. Very calm, soft-spoken man.
That's pretty much the way he was.
Yeah, I would like to add to that. For those of you who don't know me, I'm not a relative to Richard, but I might as well be. I live next door. We met each other, he and I, when we were 3 years old, and grew up next door. And Izzy and Ricky were second parents to me, as my parents were second parents to Richie and Jack. And Izzy, he was quiet and confident, and helped me get my first job teaching in Bedford-Stuyvesant, District 13. And yeah, very quiet, very modest, but there was a strength to him. You could count on him and lean on him. If he said something, it would happen, it would go through.
For those who aren't from Brooklyn, Bedford-Stuyvesant's a really distressed neighborhood. They're very challenging neighborhood. Takes special people to work there, and Stevie and my father both did.
And I love this picture.
In the mid-80s, he and my mother moved to Connecticut on a little lake there called Lake Wabika. And that's where they spent their retirement years.
This is a photo of my father's on the left. This was probably taken maybe early 1939, maybe 38. My sister Rosie was born in in the middle, she was born in 1936. So, and then Meyer was born in 1932. His baby brother was born several years later, so was not in this picture.
How did you get this picture?
It was sent to a relative in Ireland, to where my dad's relatives in Ireland, and they sent it to my dad many years later. See, despite everything that my father suffered, he had just an uncanny ability to compartmentalize and disassociate himself, and he went on, and he was able to live a life and find some happiness. So if for questions, I think if people want to use the chat box, they can, but if they want to ask questions, I think in this format it'll be probably pretty easy, don't you think?
Yeah, just unmute yourself.
Right. Here's one question here. Would I heard your dad speak many times? Continue to show the physical testimony. He spoke so lovingly of his Irish Catholic wife, my mother Susan, who I assume, was my mom. Yeah, it's true.
And he spoke of his love of Scotch whiskey.
He did like Scotch.
I've got a question, Rich. How did you track down your father's service record in such detail?
Well, Sandy probably got a better record than I did. I was online. Some of it I got out of the book that his troop wrote, Buchenwald and Beyond, which is available on an electronic copy on Sandy's website, on Sharon's website.
On the Hannah Ida Ehrman, on Hannah, www.hannahfound.org, and there's a Ben's thank you page, and then there's a sub page that has the Buchenwald and Beyond, the entire, it's a PDF format, which is just incredible to read, because it not only talks about Buchenwald, it talks about everywhere that they went. So
yeah, and if you want to email me, I can send you a PDF of it also.
Okay.
And then I did some researching today about the 120th VAC. I just Googled it. And that's where I came up with the stats. I discovered those just today.
What's piqued my interest is that my father served, around the same time at the end of the war, and talked very little about his experiences. But I do know that at the end of the war, he traveled around to displaced persons camps, looking for relatives, and it was something that I wasn't able to get in very much detail from him. But it occurs to me that his service records would probably tell me a lot about really what he did during the war that he didn't talk about.
Well, one of my many regrets in terms of my father, my brother and I, we heard the story about Buchenwald, and he talked about it. It wasn't a hidden event. He wasn't afraid to talk about it, but we never really pursued it with him. It's become much more meaningful in the last 2 years than it was during the war. I had an uncle who was a combat veteran who was some of his children are watching, who was badly wounded, and we see him around the lake. It was the kids growing up. I was so fascinated by his war wounds and his scars and the fact he was missing a toe. I paid much more attention to that than my father's own story, which I regret now.
On the records, there's I think it's called Bad Arolsen. They have a lot of records there, and the United States Holocaust Museum has records, and Yad Vashem, and there's some out there. I know there was a fire at the Army Records building in St. Louis, so some records were destroyed, but there are still some out there.
A little off the topic, but I got to say it's great to see my cousins who I haven't seen in years and years. I'm looking at my cousin Ellie's picture right now, and Randy Fox Tab and Charlie are out there.
Yeah, I just unmuted so I can say hi. This was really lovely to hear such a moving story, and hearing you guys tell it directly is different from reading it. I had read a little bit earlier, but just hearing you speak it really was quite moving. Thank you.
Thank you for joining.
Glad I could.
Huh? Oh, I actually wanted to say that I knew my Uncle Izzy my whole entire life, and I never, ever, ever knew any of this. And it's so sad because we could have learned so much. It gave me a whole different perspective about who he was as a person. He was always very kind and quiet and gentle. Somehow I never could have connected these two things. So it's really eye-opening for me to see and learn about all this stuff. And yeah, it's really interesting. We spent a lot of time, and I too remember you, Grandmother Rich. She had that great balcony on top of from her apartment.
She did.
Anyway, yeah, thank you for doing this. This was really, really very interesting and eye-opening.
It was great to see both of you.
If you read what Israel wrote, and his the other people that contributed, their perspective it's just stunning what they saw when they arrived at Buchenwald, and as Rich said, how there was nothing that they did in training, nothing prepared them psychologically for what they saw, and they didn't have the supplies, they didn't have the skills. They were stealing. They had to steal blood and other supplies because it was supposed to only be for the Americans, and they had to do all this swindling to get supplies to help people.
They had penicillin, which they were forbidden to use on anybody other than American soldiers. But since they weren't, apparently, well, it doesn't appear that they were treating any American soldiers during the time in Europe. So what they did is they created some fictional American soldiers and chalked it up to that, and they were able to give some penicillin to the doctors helping the survivors. Interestingly enough, apparently there were several doctors in Buchenwald as prisoners, as internees. And for the most part, the 120th evacuation unit worked through those doctors rather than providing direct assistance to the internees. They worked to support the doctors that were there all along. I guess language would be a barrier, and it wasn't to those doctors. And some of the survivors may have felt more comfortable using doctors they knew.
May I say something? Richard, if you've never looked for your father's Army records, you can inquire at the National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis. Sharon, it isn't just some of the records, but most of the records from the Army during World War I or World War II were burned in the fire in the middle of the 1970s. But there are some records that were salvaged, and there's some that there are fragmentary parts. So you could inquire, just provide his name and fact that he was in the Army and what his service number was, which I'm sure you know. And go online, National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis, and you should be able to get a form to request records.
I'm writing it down.
Can I say something?
Sure.
I'm Bob Friedman, and Iz was my uncle. And I wanted to add that I didn't know about Buchenwald until I went to his memorial service. His wife Lefty had put out a variety of memorabilia at the memorial service, and one of them was an account of this experience at Buchenwald. And although I knew him quite well, I had never heard of it either until I saw the letter. And hi, Richie.
Hi, Bob. Nice to see you. It just said Bob there, so I wasn't sure who was Bob who.
Yeah, age has that effect on people. We can't recognize each other anymore.
We're all a little grayer.
Yeah. Sharon, I wonder if, have you already done this, but could you tell us a little about your memories of your father when you were growing up? Did he talk about these experiences a lot, or not talk about them, or?
So he did not talk about it. And, my father he was very busy because he had 7 children to support, and he had more than one job. I remember at one point in time, he had 3 jobs. So it kind of provided, an escape for him, because he just, you could tell that he was somewhat, there was this underlying torture. And it really, for me, I was in high school when I guess they called it social studies, then social studies class, when we were studying the war. And I'll never forget the face of my teacher. Her name was Sherry Loomstein, and she happened to be Jewish, and she knew that my father was a survivor, and she held me up. So, when you're a kid growing up, it's, you only know what you know. And, I didn't realize, we had a big family, but I didn't realize that other people didn't have a family, because we didn't have any family, grandparents, aunts, uncles. For multiple reasons. My mother's family, was from Ireland, and most of my father's family, had been killed. And so my dad, he didn't talk about it. And then when he started speaking later in life, he never really sat down, and it's unfortunate, that we never sat down and had that in-depth conversation, because it was just too difficult for him. When he wrote he did a video, one of the videos that he did, he asked me to help him. I put together information and would learn, information from him as he was able to share it. And then when he wrote his book, initially he wanted me to help him, but that didn't come into being. I don't think we probably ever would have been able to do it together. And his dear friend, Mark Leach, completed that project with him. And I wrote the introduction on the beginning, which was very crazy, but very difficult. Took me like months to write 3 or 4 pages. So as my father's was going through his healing process, my mom died in 95. And so then, as I was kind of remotely involved in what my father was doing, and just learned, just just learned more as the last 20 years of his life. I did find it very was very odd that, because he would speak regularly, and I mean, it was great that he enjoyed it, but he was like a rock star. I mean, people would pick him up and they would take him places. He would go to military bases. He was traveling here and there, and it was so odd that because I was not involved in knowing, or didn't grow up with that story, and was removed from what he was sharing. But just over the last 20 years, we became very close. And I still continue to research and learn more about my father's life, my family's life, about the war, and this chapter in humanity that is just, you can't understand.
The book is very readable. It's really a great book.
So in the next couple of days, my dad self-published this through CreateSpace, Amazon, Kindle publishing. So I will go into the back office there and set up. They let you set up a promotional event, and then I will send out a link so that you can download the book. I think they give you like a 5-day window to download the book, and you can do it on a computer or on one of their readers. It doesn't have to be. You don't have to have a proprietary reader to do it.
I just ordered it.
You got it, Ann? Sorry about that.
That's okay. Does anyone else have any questions or want to share any comments?
Yes, if I may, I have an autographed copy of your dad's book, which he gave me
Nice.
as a docent at the Holocaust Museum in St. Louis. And I would show the video that the museum has of his testimony. It's a little short one. Almost every Sunday to walk-in tour groups that I would lead. The book didn't sugarcoat anything like he did talking to young kids. He wouldn't be too explicit. But one horrible thing that he talked about, even to tour groups, was being in a barracks next to the ovens at Buchenwald and hearing the screams of persons being thrown into the ovens while still alive. That'll always stay with me, how horrible that was.
I traveled to Germany, was it last year, the year before, to get this bracelet that my dad made that was found there. And when there were several pieces of the trip that were surreal, isn't even the right word. So first, when I was in the town of Weimar, I found I stumbled into a museum, and there were pictures of the Weimar Republic and then the National Socialist Party, and they were in German. The text was in German, but you could follow what was going on with the pictures. And there were the parades with just hundreds of thousands of people in the street, and where Hitler stood there in Weimar. And then when I came out, I noticed that I was standing right at the same place where these pictures were taken in in 1930. I'm not sure exactly what the year was. And I'm looking at the exact same building, and I'm standing in this courtyard, and I'm walking the same streets, and I could see the balconies that I'd seen in the pictures where Hitler and the other people were standing. No, that was a very, very strange feeling. When I arrived in Weimar, in the train station, it's a new train station. The old train station was just right next door. It's still standing, and to be standing in the same spot, where my father was, arrived in this coal car. And then when I went to Buchenwald and to walk on the same grounds, the wooden buildings aren't standing still, but many of them are. And to walk and to be in the little camp where he was initially, and my dad talks about in his book how he was promoted to the main camp, and to walk on the same grounds that my dad struggled to stay alive was very difficult. And there's a plate on the ground there. It's metal, and it's engraved with the countries where prisoners came from, and it's heated to 98.6 degrees. And I remember, kneeling down and putting, my hand on it, and it was, this is one of those moments where you just want to throw yourself on the ground. It was very overwhelming. I did not, I could see the crematorium in the distance, and the what Gary just shared, I recall reading that in my dad's book, and that while the building wasn't there, I could, I'm visualizing the building where my dad was, and then in relation to the crematorium. And the train, so the train or the truck, they would arrive by truck, and there was a disinfectant building, I think is what they called it, where my dad arrived, and they were stripped and searched, and then given new uniforms. And right next to that, as the tallest building, it's still standing, that's on the grounds, and that is the building that they stored, sorted and organized all the items that were taken from Jewish and other people during the war, because Buchenwald was built in 37. So this is a very large building, and you just, trying to process the amount of items that were, that were taken from people and stored in this very large building. It's still standing today. It's used as the museum there. And this bracelet that my dad made, where it's not really unknown where it was taken from him, but it never made it in that building because it was, it was not or if it did, it was then discarded outside the building perimeter on the grounds. Maybe possibly it was a trash pile there, because it wasn't gold, and it was of course of no value to anyone. It's engraved with my father's name, the number that was tattooed on his arm, 1944, and the number 28. So it's very very difficult trip. And I thought about Israel, when I was there also. So this, all these stories, being there, what the Americans were doing, what my father was doing, and other people.
Well, it's amazing that these two separate lives just sort of intersected at this one moment in time.
Yeah.
Well, we've been on for an hour, Sharon.
Okay, all right. Well, if anyone has any further questions, feel free to email me or Rich. Thank you so much for joining us this evening and letting us sit here and cry and pour our hearts out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's very, very moving.
Sweet to see.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Be
you
well,
both.
be
Thank
well.
you all.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. It was a great, interesting
Yeah.
hour. And hope to see you again, Rich.
We'll make an East Coast trip one of these days. We're about as far away as we could possibly be.